Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you joining us for our latest Greenbank Green Shoots webinar. My name is Sophie Lawrence. I lead stewardship engagement at Greenbank, and I'll be chairing today's event. For those of you that are new to Greenbank, we are the specialist ethical and sustainable investment business within Rathbones. We've been managing bespoke portfolios for a range of private clients, charities, and trusts for over 20 years, which aim to combine their unique sustainability and financial requirements. We have a long track record of using our investor voice to create positive environmental and social change on a diverse range of issues, from climate change to human rights and health and nutrition, both through engaging directly with the companies that we invest in, but also by engaging with a wide range of NGOs, policymakers, and standard setters, with the ambition of enabling wider systems change. The Greenbank team is spread across Bristol, London, Liverpool, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. And please do reach out to any of us via the contact details on our website if you would like to learn more about our services. But back to our event today, how can the finance sector help to address the problem of plastic pollution? Plastic pollution is a global issue that affects the environment, our health, our climate. Plastic production has also sharply increased over the last 70 years. In 1950, the world produced just 2 million tonnes, and it now produces over 450 million tonnes. And estimates show that over 10% of this is finding its way into our environment, including our lakes, rivers, and seas. Work has been underway since 2022 to develop a legally binding global plastics treaty to address this problem. And a couple of weeks ago, an intergovernmental negotiating committee met in Busan, South Korea, with the aim of finalising this treaty. However, after intense negotiations, no agreement was reached. Both of our speakers today are going to delve into this much more in their presentations. We are really pleased to be joined by Duncan, who is Global Initiative Lead of the No Plastics in Nature Initiative at WWF and co-lead of Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. John is going to share his perspective on the most recent set of negotiations and outline the steps that he believes are necessary to drive meaningful change. I'm also delighted to welcome my colleague Lauren O'Leary, who is an ethical, sustainable and impact researcher at Greenbank. Lauren will provide an insight into how we think about this issue when constructing investment portfolios and how we engage with our companies. We've got a quick poll for you before we start, and John is going to look at the answers at the start of his presentation. So this should appear now on the right of your screen. So please do answer it, and he'll pick that up in a moment. Where should addressing plastic pollution rank in terms of global priorities? But briefly first, onto the agenda and some housekeeping. We're going to have two presentations from John and Lauren, and then they're going to come back to join me for some questions. If you'd like to submit a question for our panel, please do so via the engagement panel on the right of your screen. You're also welcome to post your questions anonymously if you prefer. We also have some Greenbank publications available for you to download from that panel on the right of your screen, including our recent engagement review and also some recent Investor Day reviews, where we've covered themes ranging from water scarcity to unlocking a net zero future. Throughout the presentations, if you're on social media, please use the hashtags Greenbank Investments and Green Shoots. And if you do happen to lose connection, then please try and rejoin through the event link. And if you're having any issues using the conference portal, then click the headphone mic icon in the top right corner, which is also available on the engagement panel under technical support. Also, we would be really grateful if you can fill in the feedback form at the end of the webinar, which should take no more than 2 to 3 minutes. And this feedback really helps us tailor these events to your needs and helps us improve them over time. So with that, let's dive into our presentations, and I would like to introduce you all to John. So John, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Sophie, and thanks for the opportunity to join you all today. Really, I think you gave the right introduction. I am going to be talking about what we've just seen, what's happened at INC5 in South Korea. Before we do that, I'm just having a look at the poll results. It seems like plastic pollution ranks as one of the either the top or one of the global amongst the global priorities that we should be tackling. There aren't that many out there who seem to think that it's not an issue that we should be tackling, which is great because I think that aligns very much with what I'm going to talk about today and why plastic pollution matters and why global rules matter and how we address this challenge. So if you can click onto the next slide, please. I think, the point that I want to start with is that it is time to act on plastic pollution. We do know, I think, Sophie outlined some of the statistics around kind of the growing threat of plastic pollution. And I mean, it is growing exponentially. You can hear that from the production statistics, but not just that. I think if you look at the graphs at the bottom here, you can see the kind of the leakage rates, the creation of both plastic waste and the amount of leakage of that waste into the environment is doubling, tripling, and in some cases, when we look at the stock of plastic in the ocean, it's quadrupling over the next 20 years. So it really is a problem that if we don't do something about it now, we are facing a much more difficult time going forward. And I think important to highlight that it's not necessarily a new problem. In some ways it's new, but we have had, the last 3 decades, different initiatives trying to address plastic pollution, whether those be voluntary, company-driven efforts or country-driven efforts where you've seen regulations put in place around banning some materials or other types of kind of plastic-related regulations. But unfortunately, they have not really made a dent in the exponential growth curve that we see in terms of plastic pollution, which is why in 2022, the UN member states actually agreed unanimously to start negotiating a treaty on plastic pollution, recognizing that this was a global problem and it needed a global solution, which was brought into by the large majority of member states out there. If you can click onto the next slide, please. I think one of the big things that we as WWF are advocating for in the treaty, it's a treaty which is a piece of paper which no one is obligated to implement anything of, will be ineffective. If we have a voluntary treaty which encourages states to do things, it will be ineffective. And I think that logic of why we need global rules, which are common for all the different member states, comes through in terms of when you're looking at what kind of a treaty we need, what would work. And that treaty needs to work for businesses. So I think the arguments here for global rules from a business perspective are quite clear. We reduce that operational complexity where companies are required to comply with the same types of requirements in all the different geographies in which they're operating. At the moment, they're required to meet hundreds of different regulations in different countries, which are driving them in different directions, sometimes to phase out materials or sometimes to make them more recyclable. And all of those investments obviously don't make sense unless we can actually align them. And I think that goes to the second point here, this idea of enabling businesses to plan their investments. They know what's coming and when it's coming. You can make the investments needed in whether it's materials or infrastructure to kind of do the things you really need to do in this space. Simplifying reporting, I think this is particularly in the financial sector. You see this a lot. Companies are reporting more and more and more. And if each country has got a different reporting framework, asking different questions, for companies, it becomes really, really difficult to comply with all of this. And then lastly, this idea of coordinating actions. Not, at the moment, we've got different countries doing their own things and different companies doing their own things in terms of trying to address plastic pollution. And this doesn't actually facilitate the achievement of many of the targets that we see companies setting in terms of recyclability targets. And over the last few weeks, in fact, you would have seen some of the large corporates walking back on their commitments. And that's partly because they don't feel that they're able to meet these commitments because we don't have this coordinated approach to deliver at scale the kinds of recyclability that we need. I won't go into the details on the other side of the slide, but really just to highlight that if we carry on with that voluntary approach, the opposite is true of all of those points that I've just made. And it makes life really difficult for companies that are operating in this kind of global environment. It makes it more expensive, more costly, and more complex. If I can go to the next slide, please. I think perhaps when you go to kind of these UN negotiations, this is the most important point that we need to remember. We are, governments are the ones who are making the decisions at these negotiation processes. And so we need to get a treaty that works for governments. Now, obviously governments need to want a treaty that works for businesses, but their job is bigger than that. And I think it's quite clear from all the modeling that has been done to date that the kind of a global approach to addressing plastic pollution offers states the opportunity to reduce their own long-term spending on waste management because there will be less waste to manage. It also offers the opportunity to create kind of new value pools. So new sectors are created in the sense of the reuse sector, which at the moment is really struggling to get off the ground because we don't have a standardized set of rules and regulations around reuse. Could really be a multi-billion-dollar investment opportunity if we had that kind of global regulatory system in place. And also things like waste management, and particularly here, interestingly, for the MSME sector, the small-scale informal waste sector, if we had global rules, recycling, for example, where you've got rid of all of the contaminants, you've phased out all of the problematic chemicals, recycling could really be significantly improved, which creates much better livelihoods, much more opportunities for the small-scale recyclers and informal waste pickers. So, what you can see in that graph on the right there is really the modeling of showing how actually almost all sectors are likely to increase their economic activity by 2040 under a global rules scenario. The one sector that is likely to decrease slightly, obviously, is the primary plastic production sector. But overall, the benefits far outweigh the costs of making this shift towards global rules. And for countries, I think particularly developing world countries, who currently are responsible for managing this influx of waste, which they don't have a chance to weigh in on how it's designed or whether it works with their kind of national infrastructure. This opportunity to try and standardize it so that countries could agree on what enters their markets also presents a significant opportunity for governments to control this problem better. If I can click on to the next slide, please, which is arguably why we're starting this process to begin with. We need a treaty that works for the planet. And this is where I come back to my opening point, that a voluntary agreement where countries are just encouraged to take whatever actions they feel they can take is no different from the situation that we've been in up until now and has led us to the crisis that we're facing at the moment. So, it is very clear again that only this kind of harmonized global approach will actually deliver us a reduction in mismanaged waste. And that's what you're seeing in this graph in front of you. It's another study which shows the different kind of the business as usual scenario, where you get an 80, almost 90% increase in mismanaged plastic waste by 2040, as opposed to the example on the far right there, where you see a 90% reduction in mismanaged plastic waste. And that's the scenario we want to be aiming at. You can see not only does it result in less mismanaged waste, but it also actually results in kind of less plastic production overall, which I think is one of the things that we're also fighting for with this treaty. So, it is these global rules are the ones that give us the best impact in terms of reducing plastic pollution, but they also are the ones that give us the opportunity to act the fastest, at the same time have the biggest opportunity to drive kind of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions through that reduction of production piece there. So I think it's quite clear that global rules is really the opportunity with this treaty. I'll take a little bit of time to explain to you what I mean when I say global rules. I realize I've spoken a lot about the need for them, but now which global rules are we talking about? If you can click to the next slide, please. Just to share with you, at least initially, I think the scope of the treaty could be significant. We could look at a lot more things over time, but for this first iteration of a treaty, really what we're talking about is these global binding rules on the parties to the agreement around both, we need these core provisions around global bans and phase outs of the most problematic and avoidable kind of products and chemicals of concern to get rid of the worst that are really making life problematic. And then on the other side of things, we need kind of global product design requirements, which ensure that those products which we are going to continue to use are safe and easy to kind of reuse, recycle, and actually can circulate within the system. So alongside those binding provisions, obviously we need a kind of means of implementation. This typically means finance, but not exclusively. We need to ensure that there's enough finance, both private and public, to enable countries to deliver and implement these obligations, and obviously particular support for the developing countries out there. And lastly, underpinning it all is these mechanisms for gradual strengthening. We know that we don't know everything about plastic pollution at this point in time, and we know that we'll need to kind of ramp this up over time. So we'll need a way to incorporate additional mechanisms and rules and approaches to this over time. If we have that kind of a treaty in place, we're relatively confident that actually plastic pollution, we can turn the tide on plastic pollution. I will jump now into the next slide, where I'm really showing you where that's what we've been arguing for throughout the treaty negotiation process since 2022. We've been through now, just had the fifth, which was supposed to be the final Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee meeting last month in Korea. And unfortunately, we didn't get to a final outcome, which I'll tell you a little bit about more. But if you look at that process, the idea was originally we were going to, by the middle of 2025, have the diplomatic conference where parties agreed to hopefully those binding measures that I talked about before. What in fact happened at INC 5, if you'll click to the next slide, please, was we didn't finalize any agreement. And I think I've included on the right there kind of one of the headlines of global plastics talks collapse as oil states rebel. And I think collapse is probably too strong a term. We didn't get to a final outcome, but we have agreed to have an INC 5.2. And at INC 5.2, I think we are hopeful that we will actually get to a final agreement. So there is an ongoing process. Just to discuss a little bit about what happened. One of the biggest challenge was that we had blocker countries, essentially, particularly the oil producing states, who really opposed progress on this treaty on pretty much every front. Led by kind of some of the Arab states and Russia. They were fighting against all elements put on the table, and using this kind of rule of consensus as a stalling mechanism. And I won't go into too much detail, but I think it's important to recognize that we don't actually require consensus-based decision-making in the UN structures in order to come to an agreement. There is a voting, and it does allow for voting, but unfortunately, none of the UN member states are yet willing to use this tool. I think despite the disappointment of not getting to a final agreement in Busan, there are some really positive developments that we saw happening there. For the first time throughout this negotiation process, we saw the kind of progressive majority of probably more than 100 countries and a large group of leading companies in the shape of the business coalition standing up and supporting this call for ambitious action in the form of the global rules that I mentioned earlier. And I think what's really exciting is we see that these countries' red lines are aligned with these global rules, these must-haves, and they are now included in a new treaty draft text, which was also agreed as the new basis for negotiations when we start 5.2. So we've made some real progress. We now have got a document that we can start negotiations on at 5.2, and it's very clear the ambitious member states highlighted that they will not settle for a voluntary treaty. They really made it clear that they need global rules, and those global rules need to tackle the most important things like bans and phase-outs and reduction in supply, for example. If you go to the next slide, I'll just have one more slide here to share where to from here. I think for those of you who follow multilateral environmental agreements, we've had 2 COPs already this year, and actually 3 COPs recently. Now we've had the COP on desertification as well, and I think with differing levels of outcomes, a lot of people are looking at these processes and saying, what is the point? How do we make progress? But I think we're really excited because it does seem like a treaty of the willing is possible here. There is a very clear progressive majority. What we need to do is get that group of 100 plus countries to push back against this consensus-based approach, and be willing to push the process to a vote if needs be. And if the spoiler states still are blocking progress, then we would argue that that ambitious group of countries should move the process somewhere else and agree on between themselves what those kind of rules should look like. And then over time, add new parties to the agreement as it grows and develops. And so there are avenues for concluding this process in the next year. And I think, although I at 3 a.m. the morning after negotiations concluded, I was a little bit down. I think, in retrospect, looking at where we've got to, it is actually an exciting space to be in. And I think 2025 will be a really important year for plastic pollution and this global treaty. So thanks very much, Sophie. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, John. Yeah, really fascinating to get your insights and also the first-hand experience of really being on the ground there in South Korea in the recent negotiations. And also really encouraging, I think, to hear that you think there has been sort of significant progress made on some of those areas that you were just chatting through. And let's look to 2025 and hope to see some conclusions and further progress then. I'm sure we'll pick up some of that a lot more in the Q&A. But for now, I'd like you to introduce you all to Lauren. Lauren, over to you, please.
Thanks, Sophie. And good afternoon, all. Thanks, John, for that really insightful presentation. And building on some of the themes that you highlighted, I'm going to delve into this issue from the investor perspective. In particular, how we at Greenbank are driving change and aligning our strategies to sustainable outcomes. Next slide, please. Ethical and sustainable investing is central to our mission, and our approach is deeply integrated with global sustainable goals that address both societal challenges and opportunities for long-term growth. Here at Greenbank, we've created a framework of our 8 sustainable development goals, thieves even, and this is how they guide our investments and prioritize our engagement activities. These are aligned to the ambitious UN Sustainable Development Goals, but they focus on sustainable development that companies and investors have the greatest potential to influence. Greenbank's research team and wider investment team assess and debate how these play out in the long run, considering political, societal, and technology drivers that create risks and opportunities for the companies that we invest in. We define long-term environmental and social goals for these themes and seek investments that align to one or more of our themes. We understand that these are interconnected, as many sustainability issues often span multiple areas and industries. For example, preserving ecosystems and biodiversity can contribute to climate action and can positively impact human health and resource scarcity. Some of the critical themes surrounding plastics, which you can see in our slide now, are resource efficiency and habitats and ecosystems. And this will guide our discussion today. So next slide, please. So why plastic pollution matters? I wanted to direct you to some of the statistics that I have on the slide that illustrate why plastic pollution is not only an environmental challenge, but a pressing issue for investors. So first, let's look at the scale of the issue. Every year, we produce 430 million tons of plastic, and shockingly, 2/3 of that is turned into waste almost immediately. This waste has devastating impacts. It harms wildlife, damages ecosystems, threatens human health, and have severe economic losses. The social and environmental costs are staggering. It is estimated that between $360 billion annually. These include health impacts from toxic emissions and hazardous chemicals, as well as the expansive cost to clean up our oceans and the loss of vital marine ecosystem services to many different countries, such as tourism and fisheries. These are real, tangible costs that industries and governments are currently bearing, and they are rising. The reality is even more stark when you look at the impacts on human health. Every week, we consume approximately 5 grams of microplastics. This is the size of a credit card. This is through the food we eat, the water that we drink, and the air that we breathe. This is not just a consumer health issue anymore. This is a liability for industries that are tangentially aligned to these systems, be it food production or water distribution. So there are some of the risks that are posed to investors and the wider industry. But there's also, like John mentioned, a huge opportunity. Approximately 70% of plastic reduction comes from innovative solutions. These are reuse and refill systems, or can be new delivery models. These solutions are disrupting traditional plastic-reliant industries, and they can create new markets and scalable opportunities for companies and investors willing to lead the way. The current model of plastic production and disposal is not sustainable, economically, socially, or environmentally. But this creates a unique challenge and a chance to drive change and capture growth that focuses on circular economy innovation and sustainable material. Next slide, please. So Greenbank's approach. Investors are increasingly recognized and attuned to the long-term financial risks and opportunities of unchecked plastic pollution. Our approach integrates circular economy into our investment decision as we would with any other sustainability issue, with a clear and structured framework. This can be thought about in 4 different sections: assessing risks and opportunities, exclude worst practices, include innovative solutions, and engagement. So looking at assessing risks and opportunities, we conduct bottom-up research that evaluates the risks companies are facing, but also the opportunities that could be harnessed from innovating in this space. Companies failing to address their environmental impacts, such as heavy reliance on single-use plastics or poor waste management, are excluded from our investment universe. We prioritize companies that are actively providing solutions in alternative materials, improving recycling systems, and reduce plastic waste. Companies can support circular economy through either the products and services they produce or how they operate. The companies that Greenbank invest in, we like to call them, are the mitigators. These have robust strategies to reduce plastic pollution. They excel in waste management. They have industry-leading recyclable initiatives and are engaged in sustainable packaging. But we also have the innovators. These are companies at the forefront of sustainable innovation. They produce bio-based products. They are pioneering circular supply chains and improving resource efficiency through cutting-edge technology. Our research is thorough, ensuring we deeply understand the company practices, the sustainability of our product design, and the credibility of their commitments. This helps us ensure that our client portfolios not only avoid harm, but generate tangible benefits for people and planet. And then finally, engagement. Through our engagement, we encourage companies to adopt more ambitious targets and embed circularity in their operations. In doing so, we not only deliver on our client values, but position our portfolios to drive positive change while fostering a more resilient, sustainable global economy. And I'm going to dive into some of our engagement activities in the next slide. So the next slide, please. So as a responsible, active investor, we believe engagement is a powerful tool to enact positive change. At Greenbank, engagement centers around open dialogue with the companies to influence strategies, disclosures, and practices with the aim of enhancing long-term value. You can think of engagement in 3 different ways. We can do direct engagement with our portfolio companies. We can shape public policy by engaging in policymakers. And we can do collaborative engagement with other industries within the investors in the community. We take an active approach to engagement here at Greenbank, and it is core to our service, and it complements our investment analysis. We recognize the power of collaborative engagement as it increases our reach and impact, and enables us to create change on a deeper, more widespread scale than we could achieve individually. So touching on some of the engagement activities we've done, We've been engaging on this topic since 2018, and some of the early engagement was being the new plastics economy global commitment. This was launched by Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the EU Environment Programme. We continue to endorse this commitment as it seeks to drive systematic change by uniting businesses, governments, and stakeholders to rethink and redesign the future of plastics. We've also taken a proactive approach by having our Investor Day in 2019 on circular economy. This highlights Greenbank's efforts to drive sustainable solutions in this space and support businesses on a transformative journey. One of the key milestones this year was Greenbank joining the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. And John has highlighted some of the benefits of the coalition has had on the INC process from the very beginning to INC 5 that we've just had and beyond. So being a part of this coalition helps elevate our voice on this critical issue. And finally, Greenbank has signed the financial statement on plastic pollution alongside 160 other financial institutions with $15.5 trillion in combined assets. This was presented at the member states at the negotiations of INC 5 and underscores the critical role of finance in advocating for systematic change. Some of the key asks for this statement include aligning financial flows, both public and private, with the objectives of the UN Global Plastics Treaty, set harmonized targets and binding obligations across the plastics value chain, enabling businesses and financial institutions to make more informed, policy-driven investment decisions with regard to the full plastic value chain. And 3, catalyze further private investment to end plastic pollution through public-private partnerships, blended finance, and de-risking mechanisms. Collectively, these efforts demonstrate Greenbank's commitment to addressing plastic pollution and championing a sustainable, more circular future. By leveraging our active engagement and sustainable investment analysis, we are driving meaningful impact. Thank you. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Lauren. And if I can welcome John back to the screen to join Lauren and I for the Q&A. So as a reminder to everyone, you can ask a question using the engagement panel on the right of your screen. We've had some great ones that have already come in, so I'm going to dive straight in. And if I can ask my two panelists to please keep your answers quite brief so that we can get through a few different questions, hopefully in the 10 minutes or so that we've got. If I can start with you, John, you've obviously been very involved with the negotiations to date and over the last few years. You've talked a little bit about where you think the discussions will go from here, but what do you see as the most likely scenario to play out in early 2025?
Sophie, what I'm really excited about is this is the development of a new agreement, as opposed to some of the other places like on climate and biodiversity, where those are already existing agreements. So it's an opportunity for member states to kind of take some of the learnings from those processes and hopefully, recognize that you need to have we need a strong kind of foundational agreement in order for it to be effective. So I'm hopeful that in 2025, member states are actually going to be bold. And as I said, either drive the process through kind of the UN, via the process of a vote, or, if needs be, move it outside of that kind of the traditional UN forum and take those kind of group of 100+ ambitious countries, get them together and say, well, what can we agree on in terms of rules that could bind us as a group of countries? I know it sounds very ambitious when you look at, the state of kind of geopolitics around the world at the moment. But as I said, you could see at the INC that we've reached a kind of a deadlock of saying, well, the spoiler or the blocker states weren't going to change their position. And it's increasingly clear that the ambitious states aren't going to settle for something that's not meaningful. So, we're heading to this kind of culmination, which I think is, in a sense, good for all of us, because it's going to force us to kind of evaluate what these other options are, and they are on the table. And our hope is that the member states will take them seriously and follow one of those two options.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's really encouraging to see that there are those different tracks of approaches. And even if you, as you say, if it comes out of the UN kind of framework for the time being, but stays really strengthened and with those kind of mandatory measures in there rather than voluntary, really giving it that backbone, over time that could expand and there'll be that broader kind of, I guess, effect of really wide company support, wide government support that will be difficult to ignore kind of further down the line. And I just wanted, just while we're on the treaty, to pick up on this kind of issue of enforcement. You mentioned the importance of enforcement. Kind of what do different enforcement mechanisms look like? Will that rely on kind of individual governments to regulate their own enforcement measures in response, or what are WWF kind of wanting to see around enforcement?
So, I mean, typically, these kinds of global agreements, there are a few pieces to it. One is that, you obviously don't have a kind of global enforcement authority that goes around and checking on each of the individual countries. Countries do have to self-report to the Conference of Parties, how they're doing in terms of implementing their obligations. But I think perhaps more importantly is that countries, typically a good agreement incentivizes countries to participate. So you've seen this in other examples of the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, for example, where as soon as you became a party to the agreement, you got a lot of financial support to actually implement the obligations. And then also access to technology and some of these other things to kind of move you ahead and innovate in this space. So it's not actually, many people kind of say, well, who's going to check that you've phased out these materials? I think the idea is that it's actually countries will be incentivized to move in that direction, and also if 60, 70 other countries are phasing out or eliminating some of these problematic materials, you won't be able to put them onto export them to those markets anymore. So it will actually it will kind of self-enforce in a sense some of these rules, which we're hoping to put in place. So I think the enforcement is actually not as critical. We're not looking to have that kind of global oversight of enforcement with the stick. It's much more about carrots in this space.
Interesting. That's a good segue maybe to think about the role of investors a bit more, and moving to you, Lauren. Kind of what would be the main investment implications of a global plastics treaty?
Yeah, Sophie. So I think some of the kind of key investment implications would be an increased investment in alternatives. Where we can see companies that are innovating in this space, such as bioplastics, recyclable technology, and sustainable materials. And these will attract government incentives, as well as companies aligning to these treaty principles. They'll be more resilient to regulation shifts and reputational risks out there. And I think from an engagement point of view, it could be great as we can have that influence on corporate behavior, which we are looking at demanding the alignment of this treaty. And as investors, we're constantly asking companies to do more, be more transparent through disclosures. And I feel like this treaty will be able to help with that.
Definitely. So yeah, is that where you're going to be focusing in 2025 on this topic? And I guess also kind of what do the opportunities look like through the Business Coalition for a global plastics treaty for investors to be involved in that engagement?
Yeah, and like I touched on in my presentation, through engagement, you can do it in many different ways. And being involved in that Business Coalition is great as it provides that platform, and it has that much more global reach. And we can advocate for robust treaty provisions. We can align business strategies with circular economy principles by actively engaging and talking about the coalition. And then showing support for the private sector as well about the potential opportunities, and level the playing field in this space by constantly discussing about the coalition that's going on and the implementation of what the treaty would hold.
Great. And John,
just add,
oh
Sophie,
yes, yeah, please do.
I do think one of the things that's exciting and makes plastics somewhat different from something like biodiversity, where this COP16 was all about financing kind of biodiversity and which member states are going to step up and finance the developing world. I think that in the plastic space, there's probably a bigger role for private finance, which is great because it's not going to, governments can see that's not all on them, and there's public finance to actually support the kind of mechanisms needed. I think an enabling kind of policy framework, which actually unlocks, technologies or around reuse and recycling and some of the kind of logistics behind that. As soon as many of those things are kind of marginally profitable, and then the oil price drops and suddenly recycling can't compete with virgin oil, and so it's very difficult, volatile industry to get involved in, and that's why you don't see enough investment going into that space. But there's a lot of private finance looking for a home in that kind of impact investment space, which, if we get this correct kind of enabling policy framework, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that to flow towards those kinds of industries out there, which for me is exciting on all sides. Governments should be excited, and obviously private sector finance as well, because now they can actually kind of deploy this finance into the spaces that we need it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it's a very tangible investment opportunity, right? You can see it and feel it, which really helps. And Lauren, I guess just picking up on, you mentioned the engagement we're doing with companies. I mean, how much are companies reporting on their plastics footprint and their kind of impact in this area for us to be able to kind of analyze?
Yeah, so we have seen some companies taking steps to report on plastic usage, their waste management and reduction efforts, but the level of detail and standardization is inconsistent. And this variability makes it difficult to assess the real impact of these actions. And they have the current reporting is not as the same rigor as the climate related disclosures that have that binding treaty behind them. So I think the introduction to mandatory standardized plastics disclosure would bring transparency, consistency, and credibility, and be able to compare those companies in the same similar industries. And I think having a treaty like this would be able to spearhead that forward.
Great. Yeah, it really just creates that level playing field then, doesn't it, for companies to be operating in. And especially as kind of, John was just mentioning, we've got a lot of disclosures at different, jurisdiction levels, whether that's the EU, the UK, US, and so on. And it is becoming increasingly difficult, I think, for companies to, adhere to a lot of those reporting burdens. So consistency is really key. Great. And there's been a few questions around kind of what individuals can do to influence change, and, really acknowledging, in our everyday lives, we're walking around and we can't escape single-use plastics in so many different parts of our life. Have either of you got ideas of what individuals can be doing to influence any change in this area?
You want to start, John?
Sure. I mean, there are two pieces to that. I think, we're all consumers at some level, and I think we can, we should all be taking our own bags. We should be trying to use usable coffee cups. All of these kind of small little things, not necessarily because of the kind of market signal that they send, but I think it's amazing actually what it is peer pressure. So if your colleagues are doing it, then kind of you feel you should do it too, and that's how kind of some of these movements start and grow. And I've certainly seen it working. That's starting to shift, and that's where the kind of innovation has to happen. That some of these other kind of policy instruments can then take over and scale. But I think the one thing that I would say in my experience is, as an individual, it kind of can be overwhelming trying to change the bigger system with your individual purchasing power. I think that your voice is more important potentially than your wallet in this space sometimes. And when you see at these negotiations, governments are acting on behalf of who they think their stakeholders are, and whether that's kind of industry and civil society. If governments feel that there's actually pressure on them, that their citizens want them to agree on a treaty, they want them to act on this, governments want to come home from these negotiations with, a treaty in their hands and say, look what we did for you, And then, so I think as an individual citizen, you need to make sure that governments know that you care about this issue, and that, you're upset about this issue and that you expect them to do something about it. There are lots of ways that you can show that. You can sign petitions, you can be even more active, but I think the real risk is this kind of disengaged population where they kind of someone's expecting someone else to solve the problem. You know, if you've got to stay engaged, you've got to raise your voice, make sure that people know that you exist, and that's possibly particularly now after this kind of INC5 where you saw the headline collapse. You know, people might just kind of lose energy. Actually, now is the time where we've got to keep that energy up.
Great, thank you. And we're just about time, but Lauren, I just want to give you just one chance to say, do you agree with that? Anything else? Final comment from you before I wrap up?
Yeah, I really just want to echo what John has said. And I think change happens faster when it is collective. And I think that collective action really helps build momentum that's needed to push the businesses, the policymakers, the government towards those sustainable practices and a more circular economy. So yeah, really just echoing what John has said, really.
Well, a big thank you to both of you and to everyone taking the time to join us today. Please do take the time to explore our other areas of focus through our website, and please do fill in the feedback form on the right of your screen. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you join us again soon. Thanks and goodbye. Have a good rest of the day.